Hello, biologists. Welcome to lecture 7. We're going to talk about community ecology. When we talk about community ecology, we have to talk about niches. So a niche is everything that a population needs to survive. It's like where it fits in the world. It's its niche, which is why we use that word sometimes to mean you found your place in the world. For us as biologists, a niche means everything like food, shelter, water, resources, space to hunt, space to nest, everything that you would need as a species in your area to exist. Because it's everything you need, you can't really share a niche indefinitely. So if you try and share a niche, you end up competing with everyone around you. We call that the competitive exclusion principle, or you end up partitioning out your resources so that everybody can get what they need within a smaller area. And that's what I'm showing you here with this picture. This is resource partitioning. We have all these different types of anole lizards. This is from an experiment in the 70s. And what they found was that these different lizards shared the same trees, shared the same habitats, ate similar foods, had similar behaviors, but the way they spaced themselves out meant that they weren't sharing exactly the same niche. Because they can't share the same exact niche, they have to space and partition everything. So I'm going to make sure you can see my pointer. Here we go. Now you can see the red dot. Some of these lizards, this larger lizard, it preferred the crowns of the tree, but some other lizards preferred the trunks. Some preferred thin branches, some preferred thick branches. And it's not just that they prefer it, they spend the majority of their time there. So you and I can share the same tree, but if I only stay in my area and you only stay in your area, we're not going to interact and we won't have to compete as much inside of these niches. There were also types of lizards that only stayed in bushes, so they wouldn't go to the trees. Some only lived on cactuses. So they share the same environments. They eat the same things, do the same things, but they've partitioned out the space so that they're not actively competing within their niche. We have this great example of competition. It's birds again. We love birds in this class. So here we have different types of warblers. They will have similar food, similar habitat, similar behaviors, except some of them will like the outside of the tree. So the more toward the edge of the tree, or the interior of the tree, the apex of the tree versus the base of the tree. So in one tree, you could have these 5 different species of warbler existing and partitioning out their resources. Now, what happens if you need to compete? Then we get this barnacle experiment. And I love the title of this image, Squeezed Out by the Competition. So here's how it works. We've got 2 types of barnacles. We've got the big barnacle, the semibalanus, and then you have the smaller barnacle right here. And both of these barnacles exist in the intertidal zone. I have high tide designated by this blue line. So at high tide, the water comes up to right about here, right below the grass. And then at low tide, it drops down to down here where this shell is, that shell. So this is the intertidal zone where it goes in and out, that space that gets covered in high but is exposed at low tide. And in the intertidal zone, they found that the smaller barnacle that starts with a CH is at the higher zone. So the zone that's only covered by water at high tide and is exposed most of the other times. The larger barnacle was in the lower part of the intertidal zone. So they were curious what was going on. And what they did was they removed all of one type of barnacle in different locations. So they removed all the big ones or all the little ones, and then they watched what the barnacles did when they weren't competing for the space. And it turns out, so we have our 2 different barnacles here, the one that's a little pink color, the one that's a blue color. It turns out that theoretically, the little barnacle can live in the entire intertidal zone. And it will if the bigger barnacle's not there, but the bigger barnacle will literally push it up. And the bigger barnacle can't live in the apex of the intertidal zone. It can't get that dry. It can only live in the lower portion of the intertidal zone. So the larger barnacle lives exactly where it wants to live. Its realized niche and its fundamental niche are the same. And little barnacle that could live in the whole area gets pushed upward. So it only gets to live in the margin where the big barnacle can't. So if that big barnacle could live in the entire intertidal zone, there's a good chance that it would just push the little barnacle out completely and maybe lead to an extinction event, who knows? So this is competition. This is our competitive exclusion principle. The little barnacle is being excluded from where it could live because it's being outcompeted by the larger barnacle. This is not partitioning it out. This is not sharing. Now, I love barnacles for many reasons, and one of my favorite reasons that I love barnacles is they have really, really interesting reproductive organs. So let me show you a little video.
Here's everything you wanted to know about barnacle penises, but we're too afraid to.
Okay, I changed the speed and I turned up the volume. Here we go.
Here's everything you wanted to know about barnacle penises, but we're too afraid to ask. I'm Anna Rothschild, and this is Gross Science. Listen, barnacle penises are fascinating things. First of all, they're gigantic. Certain barnacles have penises that extend 8 times the length of their bodies, giving them the largest penis to body size ratio in the entire animal kingdom. Their sex organs are large for a reason, though. You see, barnacles are sessile creatures, which means that the adults attach themselves to something like a rock or a boat, and then basically don't move for the rest of their lives. But if you can't move, how do you find a mate? Well, one way is to grow a ridiculously long penis and use it to reach over and inseminate your neighbors.
Well, hello there.
And the longer the organ, the more partners you can reach and inseminate. On top of that, some barnacles can actually change how their penises look based on where they're living. Pacific acorn barnacles that live in calm waters tend to have long, thin penises, while those living in more turbulent waters tend to have shorter, stouter penises. This makes sense from a hydrodynamic perspective, since a shorter, wider, heavier penis would bend less and be easier to maneuver in a rough sea. The really crazy thing is that if you take a Pacific acorn barnacle that's lived its entire life in a turbulent area and you transplant it to a much calmer area, that same individual will change its penis size and shape to accommodate its new conditions. This neat trick is a great example of something biologists call phenotypic plasticity, which is the ability to change your physical traits in response to the environment. I realize that my enthusiasm about barnacle penises might sound a bit immature, but I'm in good company. Charles Darwin wrote extensively about barnacles and their reproduction, and he too was wowed by their penises. Ew. Got a question about...
You're welcome for that. So, barnacle penises. Now, when we talk about communities, we also have to think about community structure. So community structure is determined by two main things. The first is community richness, which is the number of species, like there's 1, 2, 3, 4 species in this area. And then species evenness, which is the relative abundance of species. So if there's 4 species, but there's only 5 individuals of the first 3 and 500 of the last species, that would not be a very even community. So the relative abundance of species and the number of species. If we look at those two measures together, richness and evenness, it helps us determine the biodiversity of an area. So biodiversity is described as an index. That's just what we call it. And we determine species diversity index by taking the total number of species divided by the total number of individuals. So just a little bit of math. And let me show you an example of this. I've got 2 different communities of mushrooms here. I've got community A and community B. How many species are in community A? So there's the yellow one, the orange one, the brown one, and the purple one. So there's 4 species in community A. That would be the answer to species richness. 4. What about community B? How many different species are there? Still 4. So the richness number for these 2 communities is equal, but we can tell that these 2 communities are not the same, right? Like community A has unequal species evenness, which is the distribution of how many species of one type versus another type there are. So there's only one of each of these 3 species, but a lot of the other species. So community A has an unequal species evenness. Community B has a more equal species evenness. Ooh. So there is roughly the same number of each type of species. So that's what we mean by richness versus evenness. Yeah. Here's another one. Imagine that the different shapes represent different species. Which community has both low species richness and low species evenness? Go ahead and take a moment to answer that question. It would be option B. So there's only 2 types of species, and there is an unequal distribution of those species. So low richness and low evenness. If I ask for which one has the highest species richness and the highest species evenness, what would be the answer? It'd be D, right? There are 3 species available here, and they are more equally distributed. Here we still have 3 species, so these have the same species richness, except we have an unequal distribution of the different species. The blue square species is overrepresented compared to the other 2 species. So this would have lower evenness than D does. And this matters because when we're thinking about communities, we have to start thinking about ecosystems next. So a population is one species in one place at one time. A community is more than one species in one place at one time. And the ecosystem starts to think about the abiotic factors like water and temperature and all the things that control who lives in this place, when and where, and who gets to survive best. If you have more species in your habitat, in your ecosystem, there's a higher chance that your ecosystem will bounce back after a disaster. This is called the insurance hypothesis. You're ensuring that your ecosystem will be able to be resilient. And the idea is, if I have a lot of species, then some of my species will play the same role, like there'll be more than one decomposer, there'll be lots of different types of primary producers, there'll be lots of herbivores, lots of predators. And if I have lots of different people playing the same role, if one of them gets taken out, my ecosystem will still survive. If I only have one type of primary producer and that primary producer dies off, the entire ecosystem will collapse. Think about keystone species. The way a keystone species, if it's removed, will affect the whole ecosystem. So if I can get redundancy in each layer, then I can have my ecosystem be more stable. We want fundamental redundancy in our groups. And that leads to another idea. This is called a monoculture. Mono being one, culture meaning we're growing one thing. There are a lot of monocultures in the world. Agriculture is a big cause of loss of biodiversity, and we're going to talk about that shortly in a week or two. And in this ecosystem, there is no redundancy. Like if I released a fungus that killed corn into this ecosystem, the entire thing would collapse. And when we plant corn like this, we have a lot of other issues that we have to worry about. We have to think about what kind of pesticides am I putting on it? Are the pesticides wind dispersed? Are they going to blow into the farm next door? Are they getting into the water? It gets really complicated really fast. And so for the species diversity index, this would essentially be like a 0, right? It's the number of species, 1, over the number of individuals, a whole lot. So it'd be a really, really small number. And that's not a very stable ecosystem. It leads to less ability to bounce back from a disaster. But it is beautiful, and I do love to eat corn. So thanks for this lecture. If you have any questions, email me.